this happened a while ago. This was not, this was pre-pandemic. So talk about how this case has kind of come back to life in a weird sense, and gained all this traction now. And especially, I think it's interesting, he was wearing a mask.
Right. So as you know, Elijah McLean was killed last August of 2019. He had gone to the corner store to get some iced tea. He was in the habit of wearing a mask before we all started wearing masks, so now it would be no big deal. But at the time, even then, to the people in the convenience store, it was no big deal. You can see from the surveillance video in the store, he's having a friendly interaction with all the people there. As he's leaving, he bows his traditional gratitude bow as he's walking out the door, and he proceeds to walk the few blocks to go home. Unfortunately, a 911 caller calls and says that there's somebody who's acting sketchy. And the caller even says he might be a good guy, he might be a bad guy, I just don't know. But he's got no weapons, he's not suspected of committing any crime, and nobody is in danger. So that's what the police knew coming into this. Notwithstanding those facts, 3 Aurora police officers not just stopped Elijah for no reason, but immediately grabbed him, went hands-on. Elijah's response was, "Hey, I'm just going home. I'm an introvert. Please respect my boundaries." But they didn't respect his boundaries. They proceeded to grab him, throw him up against a wall, tackle him to the grass, and then inflict force on him over the course of about 15 minutes, 2 carotid chokeholds, multiple kinds of different pain compliance techniques. I mean, to say he was tortured is not an exaggeration. It went on for about 15 minutes. As he's on the ground in pain, the pain was so extreme as to cause him to vomit. Police still showed him no mercy. In fact, there was one officer who joked, "Don't get that on me." Another officer who thought Elijah wasn't lying still enough as he's dying and trying to breathe, said that he was going to bring in a dog to bite him if he didn't quit messing around. I mean, the lack of humanity is really mind-boggling. But Elijah still was not doing anything to fight. In fact, what he was saying was things like, "I don't have a gun, I don't do fighting, I don't even kill flies, I'm a vegetarian, I don't eat meat, I don't judge people." I mean, all of the things he was saying showed these officers clearly that he was not fighting, he was just trying to breathe. And in fact, even like so many men, he ultimately said, "I can't breathe." And it's one of the last things he says. Eventually paramedics come. The last thing he can be heard saying to them very, very quietly is, "Please help me." They didn't help him. What they did instead is that even though he was handcuffed on the ground, fully restrained, not struggling or fighting, they injected him with a massive dose of ketamine, a tranquilizer. He then suffered 2 cardiac arrests and was ultimately placed on life support for a number of days until he finally succumbed.
Now, can we talk about the legality of giving someone ketamine in that type of situation? Where does that come from?
Well, it's not legal. There was absolutely no legal right to involuntarily inject Elijah with ketamine. He was fully restrained, he was not fighting, and there was no reason to do it, and let alone to give him a dosage that, if appropriate for anybody, would have been for somebody over twice his size. But they had no legal right to do it at all.
Okay, and I mean, let's talk about the approach. I mean, the approach that by officers was abrupt. I mean, it was, anyone, I feel like, who's approached like that by an officer is going to be, I mean, combative for one, but I wouldn't say Elijah was combative. He was taken aback, so I mean, is there a legal issue there too?
Well, the Aurora police officers had no legal right to even stop him. There was no reasonable suspicion to believe he had committed any crime because the 911 caller said as much. He's not suspected of committing any crime. So there was no legal reason to stop him. But your point is well taken. I think that this is every parent's worst nightmare. Black parents across the country try to tell their children, and particularly their sons, how to deal with law enforcement. And Elijah did every single thing right. He was polite, He said his name. He said he was just trying to go home. He said he was an introvert, but he was polite the entire time. He was not at all combative, and yet this happened. And so what this tells every parent is petrifying, that even if your son does every single thing he should, he may be killed by law enforcement like Elijah was.
Talk about how the family, I guess, feels and has been kept in the loop throughout this entire situation.
This has been incredibly hard on Elijah's family. They've been mourning alone for the last 10 months. And to be clear, even after these officers killed Elijah, they didn't let the family even be alone in the room with him. They still didn't tell the family what it was that happened, and they wouldn't even leave them alone in the room with him. They continued to watch his family, so they couldn't even mourn the loss of their son in privacy. It was only when officers finally left the room that they could even take pictures. I mean, it was a crazy situation. And Aurora police have persistently tried to interfere with the truth finding the entire time. Aurora Police Department representatives were in the autopsy, as were members of the district attorney's office, who refused to prosecute them because, of course, they're working hand in glove. The Aurora police have denied accountability the entire time. They, I believe, knocked off their body cameras intentionally. And the reason I believe it's intentional is because throughout the course of those 15 minutes of torture, we hear a few different times when an officer says something like, "Get that camera away from me, dude," or they talk about having turned off cameras that were recording. It's very clear that it's not just an accident. They're trying to do everything in their power to avoid all accountability. And now here we are almost a year later, and until now, they have thought they were successful. Another aspect of this that you probably know, and maybe we're going to be asking me about, is a couple of months after these officers murdered Elijah, two of the officers who stood idly by and failed to intervene to stop the torture actually went back to the site and laughingly reenacted the murder of Elijah. They reenacted the chokehold that their colleagues had used to kill this innocent young man walking down the street. And you can tell from the looks on their face, they think it's absolutely hilarious. This is a vestige from the Jim Crow South, when fascists would go and take their pictures next to the hanging bodies of lynching victims and then send them around as postcards. In this instance, what the police officers did is they then texted these pictures of them reenacting the murder of Elijah McLean to the officers who were responsible for the murder, who were the hands-on officers who murdered them. One of those officers, Officer Rosenblatt, responded, "Ha ha." He thought it was just hilarious. I mean, this shows the absolute depravity of this police department, that they not only murdered this innocent young man, but then thought it was funny and thought it was appropriate to send around those photos as though it was some kind of joke.
So why have they been fired, but the officers involved in Elijah's case have not?
Well, as one of the media commentators has noted, the irony can be visible from outer space. The fact that the officers who reenacted and sent around photos of the murder of Elijah McLean were fired, but not the actual murderers, is ridiculous. I mean, certainly those who reenacted it and sent it around should have been fired. That was an appropriate action. They absolutely should have been fired, not just for reenacting those photos, but for their failure to intervene, but they weren't fired for that. Certainly all of the officers who were involved in killing Elijah should also be fired. And hopefully they will be criminally prosecuted now that the governor has assigned a special prosecutor to look into that.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. How does the McLean family feel about the governor stepping in and doing something about this case?
Well, on the one hand, it's unfortunate that what it's taken for a responsible adult to finally step in is international media concern and millions and millions and millions of people signing online petitions. It should happen in every single case that there should be a truly independent, thorough investigation. So every single time that law enforcement kills somebody should be independently investigated. But thank goodness it's finally happening now, because it is obvious that the district attorney, Dave Young, was completely unable to do it. What he lacked was not evidence, it was a moral compass and a backbone. But he chose not to do it because he claimed there were no injuries. Astounding when you see that this young man is dead. But finally, there is going to be a thorough investigation by the state attorney general's office. The family stands by, as I do, to provide whatever information could help so that they can do an investigation and prosecute those who are involved. The officers who killed Elijah hands-on, those officers who stood idly by and failed to intervene, and of course the paramedics who gave him an illegal and massive overdose of ketamine.
Um, what does justice look like for the McLean family right now?
Well, unfortunately, the tragedy is they will never get their son back. His sisters and brothers will never get their sibling back. So justice is hard in cases like this. What does justice look like? Certainly for the family, seeing those who were responsible for murdering Elijah held criminally accountable is important. And I'm very hopeful that the investigation by the Attorney General's office and also by the Federal Department of Justice will lead to that result. And then, of course, there's also the remedy for the family and a message that is so strong sent to the Aurora Police Department that they will not do this again. And that ultimately is in the hands of a jury. A jury will have the opportunity in the civil case to look at this murder of an innocent young man who is simply walking down the street, who says all of the right things, and who is still in cold blood tortured over the course of 15 minutes and ultimately murdered. So a jury will determine what is the value of human life and what does it take to tell not just the Aurora Police Department, but police across the entire country, this is not acceptable, it must stop now.
I think you have you have direct contact with his family. Talk about Elijah.
So having spent countless hours with his family and friends and coworkers and clients, Elijah was an amazing young man. He was a massage therapist. He was a healer. He had taught himself to play the violin and the guitar. He used to take his lunch breaks to play violin for cats at a local center that were waiting to be adopted because he wanted to soothe them and make sure they weren't lonely. You can see even in the videos available online that he would give a bow of gratitude as he came into rooms and exited rooms. I mean, he was just an incredibly beautiful human being. But that isn't why his life should be so important. Every single life killed by law enforcement should be important. And it shouldn't only be the angels that walk among us. So, I mean, one of the things about this case that's so disturbing is that he did do everything right. He never had any issues with law enforcement. His worst offense in his entire life was speeding 9 miles per hour above the speed limit. I mean, there are very few of us who can claim anything close to that kind of innocence. And yet he, walking down the street in his own black skin, was treated as somebody who was dangerous and murdered. That is appalling. And it's so troubling for us as a society to have to step back and acknowledge that that is really what we're dealing with here. Even an angel walking among us who is just walking down the street in his black skin and says all of the right things, is polite, can still be murdered by a law enforcement in the America of today.
Can you talk a little bit about the support and, I mean, talk about that, the level of support that you all have received?
Well, the international outpouring of support has been amazing for Elijah's family, and particularly all of the artists who have done murals and paintings, and the musicians who have held violin vigils and who are paying tribute to Elijah's life in the ways that were most important to him. The people who are now supporting pet adoption agencies, you know, all of the people who are really coming together to make sure that his legacy means something is incredible for his family. Also, the people who have reached out to the mayor of Aurora, who have reached out to the Aurora City Attorney's Office, who have reached out to the governor, to the Attorney General's office, and even to the Federal Department of Justice to express their views on this case. That has meant the world to Elijah's family, to see that the world is watching and not another young Black man should be murdered in the same way that Elijah was.
Perfect. One last question. What do you think about this case that Governor Polis, the executive order he signed? What do you hope they find and they see in that investigation?
Well, there is ample evidence that would allow the prosecutors to jail all of the people who are involved in killing Elijah McLean. The hands-on officers, the officers who failed to intervene, and the paramedics who injected him with that massive dose of ketamine. They are all responsible criminally and civilly for their role in murdering Elijah McLean. And I'm very hopeful that a thorough independent investigation will finally yield the result that it should.